Kevin. Dr. Kevin Welch from the USDA Poisonous Plants Lab. He can probably talk a little bit about this lab, but it is nationally and internationally known for the work that they do, looking at poisonous plants and their effects on livestock. And we greatly appreciate them here. And they're another, I think, treasure here in Cache Valley that is utilized pretty heavily with our sheep here in the state. And so I'll go ahead and turn over the time to him.
All right. Thanks, Chad. It's nice to be here and talk to you guys, and hello to everybody that's online. So as Chad mentioned, I'm a scientist at the USDA Poisonous Plant Research Labs located here in Logan, Utah. It's on Utah State's campus. I'm showing a picture of the building here. We just past 20 years with this brand new building, and it's kind of a nice building and got a lot of nice features. So what I want to do today is just take a few minutes and talk to you, give you a little overview of what our lab is and what we do, and then talk a little bit about some of the plants that tend to be more of a problem for sheep producers. So what I'm showing here is the mission of our lab. And basically, to sum it up, the mission of our lab is to learn as much as we can about plants that poison livestock. And we try and learn everything about that plant. Trying to learn what the toxin is in the plant, when the plant grows, when the plant is toxic. Some plants are toxic all year long. Others are only toxic during certain parts of the year. We try and learn what species are toxic or susceptible to the toxicity. For example, larkspur is a huge problem for the cattle industry, but sheep are very resistant to larkspur and so don't cause a problem for sheep. So we try and learn all this information, and we try and take all that information that we get and then give it back to the sheep to the livestock producers, to the extension agents, veterinarians, everybody that's involved, to try and help minimize the losses due to poisonous plants. Just as a side note, we kind of estimate that poisonous plants in the United States cause over $500 million in economic losses. So it's a fairly significant problem in the livestock production in the United States. So most of the plants I'm going to talk about today are plants that we find here in the Western United States. So sorry to those of you that are from the eastern part of the country. But the reason for that is we work on the plants that we get feedback on. So if we don't know a plant is causing a problem, we can't work on it. So if you guys have a plant that you suspect being a problem, get in contact with us and we can maybe help you out. But part of the reason we focus on these plants in the Western United States is because this is where the majority of the public lands are. The forests, the BLM lands that are protected, and you can't control what plants are on those, where a lot of the other parts of the United States more of a pasture scenario, and you can control better what plants are in those pastures. But as Chad mentioned, we are the only federally funded lab that works on poisonous plants. So we do, as I mentioned, work with people all over the United States. A couple of years ago, we sent some people over to Florida with a truck and trailer to pick up a trailer full of a plant in Florida that they suspected causing problems to their cattle. Brought that plant back and did some experiments with it. And then we also work with people all over the world. We do a lot of work with people in South America, Australia, China, South Africa. So we try and help wherever our expertise might be useful. So my training as a scientist is in toxicology. And the mantra of toxicology is the dose makes the poison, because anything can be toxic if you get too much of it. If you drink too much water, I'm sure everybody's heard the stories of the frat initiation things where people drink too much water and they get sick, and some people even die from it. So anything can be toxic if it's consumed too quickly and too much of it. And that this is true for poisonous plants. When I talk to high school kids, I always ask them, how much time and effort and money do we spend raising alfalfa in the United States? It's one of the most prolific feeds that we raise is alfalfa. But yet if animals eat too much alfalfa too quickly, they can bloat and die. So anything can be toxic if they eat it too much. And then the other thing with poisonous plants is sometimes, as I mentioned, they're toxic all year long, other times they're not. And so the timing sometimes can make the difference. So what it kind of comes down to a lot of times is a balancing act. And what I'm showing is the pointer work. What I'm showing here is mountain range land that's here in the northern United States or northern Utah. But about 10 years ago, a sheep producer put a band of about 400 sheep on this area. And it was an area that he'd grazed for years and hadn't had a problem. But this year, about 10 years ago, for whatever reason, overnight, he lost about 200 of those 400 sheep. And so we got contacted and went down there. And so the question is, what was different? You know, why could he graze that for years and not have a problem? What was different that year? And so sometimes it's, as I mentioned, it's just a balancing act of, yes, we know there's poisonous plants there, but as long as everything's just fine, we'll be okay. But sometimes there's just that perfect storm. And sometimes we understand what was involved in that storm and sometimes we don't. But there are things that we know that do affect animals eating poisonous plants. And as shown here in this cartoon, body condition makes a big difference. And we've shown with the number of different poisonous plants that cattle, sheep, animals that are in poor body condition are hungry, they're looking for nutrition, and they're going to eat more indiscriminately because they're so hungry, and they'll eat more poisonous plants. Whereas if they're in better body condition, they're going to be looking for things that are fulfilling that primary nutritional need and not eating so indiscriminately. Sometimes we make management decisions that affect this. Sometimes we put a salt block in middle of a larkspur patch. Now, if you're just running sheep, this is just fine. And I would recommend this, and the cattle producers would love it if you did this, because the sheep will go in and they'll trample down this larkspur and then the cows won't eat it. But this is just to show that sometimes we make decisions where we kind of attract the animals to an area that's going to be a problem. And for sheep, an area like this might be more of a concern, where you have this watering trough, it gets beaten down and you start getting invasive plants that come into this worn out area. And one of those is halogeton. Halogeton is a very common plant to come into an area like this, and this is a problem for sheep. You bring your sheep, dump them off next to you want to put them next to some water so they get water before they go out. Well, they've been trucked in, they're hungry, they're getting water, and then what do? They start to forage. And if this is an area, fortunately, this picture right here doesn't have a lot of halogeton, but I'm just using this as an example of sometimes we make management decisions that precipitate the poisonous plant losses.
Is that what happened to the shepherd that lost the 200 sheep?
So I'm actually working on a paper right now, and we're at first we thought it was death camas, and I'm going to talk about death camas today. But then we did some more evaluations, and we don't think it was death camas, and we think maybe it was chokecherry, because there was a lot of young shrub chokecherry at the bottom of the area. And we've done some experiments, and we found that this chokecherry in this area is extremely high in cyanide, which is what chokecherry has. And I've done some experiments dosing animals, and it only takes just a little bit to kill them. So
that his animals were hungry when they arrived, and so
yeah,
they were opportunistic with whatever was convenient.
Yeah.
And that happened to be
and
toxic.
The question we still don't understand is why didn't they eat chokecherry the other years? Mm-hmm. Why was it just that year? There was a big rainstorm the night before, you know,
like you said,
yeah,
storm.
Yeah. So,
thank you.
Yep. And yes, please, if you have any questions, just ask. Might be
encourage me.
might be hard for me to see the ones online, but the people here, if you have questions, just let me know. this is starting to become more and more popular because goats are becoming utilized more and more heavily throughout the United States. Texas has kind of been a big thing for a while, but there's a lot of people here in Utah. Chad knows a lot about this, that are starting to, people have a lot more goats than they used to. Even I've got a neighbor next door to me that has some goats, so goats are becoming more and more popular. And so we always get the question, well, how does a goat respond to this? And everybody's had this misconception, you see what I said there, that goats are resistant to poisonous plants. And what we've found is, yes, there's some things that goats are resistant to, but they tend to be the things that sheep are also resistant to. And so when people ask me this question, what I tell them now is, we kind of think that sheep and goats are going to respond very similarly, more similar than a cow or a pig or, any of the other, a horse, any of the other livestock species. So unless I know something specifically, I'm going to assume that a goat's going to respond similar to a sheep. And in that regard, we use goats quite a bit in our research because it's a ruminant and it weighs about 50 pounds versus a cow that weighs over 1,000 pounds. A cow has a gestation period of about 9 months, a goat's about 5 months. So, everything's a lot quicker and a lot easier. And so we actually do use goats quite a bit in our research, along with sheep and cattle. Okay. So here's a list of plants that tend to be a problem. And again, these are plants that we've found to be more problematic here in the Western United States. So there might be some things in the Eastern United States that you guys might be having problems with. And if you do, please let me know. I'd be, as I mentioned, we're the only lab in the United States that works on this. So we want to be inclusive, and we'd also like to know of other problems that you guys might be having. But I put you on here. I'm actually starting an experiment on Monday because I'm sure anybody that's read the news the last few years has seen these incidences where not this past winter, but a couple of winters before, it was real heavy snow here in the West, and the deer and the elk were coming down into the cities, and they were looking for anything to eat, and they were finding these ewes, because ewes are an ornamental that a lot of people and plus community buildings put these ewes around there for a nice pretty green ornamental plant. However, yew is extremely toxic, and we've done a number of collaborations where we had and I'll get to this in a minute. So anyway, yews on here, even though it's an ornamental plant, just because of the number of problems we've had with it in the past, or in the recent past. So skunk cabbage, that's a name for, there's a whole bunch of name for it. I'll actually show it to you here in a second. I think corn lily, we call it Veratrum californicum, causes cyclops formation in sheep, was a big problem back in the 50s and 60s up in central Idaho. Death camas, I'll talk about that. Lupin, locoweed, halogeton. I'm going to talk about all these real briefly. Here's some others that can be concerning. Chokecherry and serviceberry both have the cyanide. Lamb's quarter, curly dock. These can have the oxalates. Dogbane and milkweed can have the cardiac glycosides that can be problematic at times. So here's you. And so right when I started at the lab, or right before I started, there was an incident here in the valley, just north of Logan, where there was an individual that had a rather large yew shrub, decided they didn't want it anymore. They cut it down, threw it over the fence. There was about 35 heifers in that pasture. And when they woke up the next morning, over half of them were dead. And so, as I mentioned, this isn't a range plant issue, but it's an ornamental issue. But anytime animals get exposed to these, there's been examples of horses being tied up, like at a big arena, like the Delta Center for a rodeo. And they'll tie them up outside the arena, and they'll eat the yew while they're waiting to go into the arena, and they get poisoned and die.
How rapid is the result? of
It's
this?
only a few hours. It's really quick. So it's a cardiac toxin. And so that's what happened with these horses is you get on them, start running them, get the heart going, and it precipitates that. Here's what I talked about with the deer and the elk. And then there's also been some recent instances of this with goats, because people have that assumption that a goat can eat anything. And so they think, oh, here, I'm going to clip this ewe to, you do your yearly shrub maintenance, and you think, oh, I'll just throw this over and let the goats eat it. And we've had a couple instances here in the state of Utah where a bunch of goats have died from that. And that's why we're doing this experiment next week, is because we want to know how much ewe does it take to poison a sheep and a goat. So we're going to test both sheep and goats. So death camas. So death camas has been historically a problem for sheep here in the Western United States. Primarily in the spring, early spring, or late spring, early summer is when it tends to be a problem. One of the biggest problems we have here in the West is this foothill death camas, and here's the distribution. So it's primarily in the West. And again, kind of an April, May issue. But here I'm showing the distribution of mountain death camas, and you see this grows pretty much everywhere. So the problem usually happens is that death camas grows early. And so on these ranges, sometimes the death camas is there when the grasses are maybe not quite as prolific. And the other thing that we've seen actually in cattle quite a bit is when you get a late spring snowstorm. Those snowstorms will come in and cover up the grasses, but the death camas is tall enough that that's what they can see. And so they'll kind of go in and they see the death camas and they go in and just kind of selectively eat the death camas and can be poisoned. And we do see that sheep are more likely to eat death camas than some of the other livestock, just because they're more likely to eat forbs. So just their grazing preferences, they tend to like death camas. So if you have animals that you suspect of being poisoned by death camas, a lot of times, when the herder wakes up in the morning, he's just going to find them dead. So it's a cardiac toxin, so it happens pretty quickly. It does cause a lot of salivation and frothing, so you'll see that around their muzzle, and it causes vomiting. So a lot of times that froth is kind of green because they've been vomiting. And it causes quite a bit of abdominal pain. They'll be weak and they'll be staggering if they're still alive. Unfortunately, there's not really anything that we know to treat it. So it's kind of, let them rest. And if they survive, they survive. If they don't, there's not much we can do to help them. What you want to do to prevent it is try and keep them away from these dense patches. So a couple of years ago, we got called up by St. Anthony, Idaho, up by DuBois. Between St. Anthony, if you draw a line between St. Anthony and DuBois, Idaho, there was an area that burned about 5-6 years ago, and that burn area has come back with just a big flush of death camas. And there was a rancher, sheep herd producer that lost quite a few sheep up there. And we went up and drove around that area, and we found there were some areas that just had really big, dense patches. And so after that, he tried to have his sheep herders keep them out of those patches. And since then, he's done a lot better. So this, we kind of already talked about this, that hungry animals are going to eat more indiscriminately. So even if they're in good body condition, when you trailer them for a day or two, they're going to be hungry, right? And, a lot of times you put them in the corral the night before, so it's been a day and a half since they've eaten. So they're going to be hungry even if they're in good body condition. And so hungry sheep are going to eat more death camas. And you can, if this is in an area that's like private land and you have the ability to spray it, there are some herbicides that do a really good job. And I'm showing some herbicide treatment studies that we've done, and we've found that there are some herbicides on the market today that do a really good job of knocking the death camas back, but still allowing, you can see there's still a lot of other grasses and that are still there.
So are they able to tolerate a small amount of this? Just a quantity?
Yeah. Yep. And Unlike, it's a really small amount. The death camas, it's quite a bit bigger dose. Okay, any questions on death camas? All right, we're gonna move to, so I call this Veratrum californicum is the scientific name for the species that's been the biggest problem here in the Western United States. There's other species of this Veratrum that grow throughout North America, and it has a whole list of common names: skunk cabbage, corn lily. I can't remember all of them right now. This was a really big problem, as I mentioned, in the 50s and 60s up in central Idaho. And there was a lot of sheep that were being born with these craniofacial malformations. And one of them that was the most prominent is they only had one eye. And so the chemist at our lab back, in the 70s and 60s and 70s, when he was working on this, he isolated the toxin in the plant that causes this, and he actually named it cyclopamine because it causes the cyclops formation in the sheep. It really affects, obviously, the development of the sheep. And as you guys know, it's the fetus that initiates parturition. So these ewes that are contained, that have these affected sheep, the fetus can initiate parturition. And so that fetus just continues to grow and grow and grow. And so these ewes get enormous and they have to be put down. So some of them were born, but some of them they're not. And so there's a, yep. So for the craniofacial malformations, we've found that it's days 13 and 14 of gestation. So think about that. That's within 2 weeks after conception. And that's because that's when the face and the eyes and that are in that developmental process. So the toxin in this plant that causes the issue inhibits cell division. So it's inhibiting the division and the growth of the head. And so whenever they eat that plant is what they're inhibiting. And so if they eat it while the face and the eyes are growing and developing, that's what gets affected. So days 13 and 14 is these craniofacial malformations. Days 28 and 31, you get some of these skeletal defects, kind of arthrogryposis type defects that are more common in lupin. And then you can also see some tracheal stenosis. So this is a normal trachea of a lamb, and this is from a lamb that its mother was fed Veratrum. And so this lamb, bless you, this lamb was probably born looking fairly normal, but obviously no air is going to be able to go through that trachea. And so the lamb will die almost immediately after birth. So the nice thing, if you can say nice, about this is it's a timing issue, right? And it's all very early on. It's all within the first month of gestation. And so our management recommendation is a simple one. It's just don't allow your pregnant ewes to go in an area that has a lot of veratrum until 30 days post, and until it's been 30 days since they've been with the ram. Because once they get past 30 days, then most of those processes of those more susceptible processes have already developed. It takes a bigger dose. The ewe normally won't eat enough to poison herself, just enough to put, so once the lamb gets bigger, then you're out of the woods with it. You can spray some areas, so you can see there's some dense patches like this. It also tends to grow in the more moist areas. So if you think a lot of these mountain valleys, there's one side that's kind of moist because it's in the shade most of the day. And so that's where the veratrum is going to grow. And so some ranchers will just take their sheep and they'll trail them up one side of the dry side at first, and then they'll cut back down the wet side, because by that time the lambs are old enough to have gone past this critical period. You can also fence it off or whatever. So This is a colleague of mine, and he's about the same height as I am. So you can see that these are fairly big plants and kind of have this pretty flower that grows. It's the sad thing is a lot of these poisonous plants are actually kind of pretty plants. And I always worry that when I'm out collecting them, that somebody's going to stop and yell at me and chew me out for picking all the pretty wildflowers. So I don't tell them what I'm doing with it because that makes it even worse. So local weed is another one that tends to be a big problem. And this is really what I would argue is maybe one of the bigger problems. And it's sheep, cattle, like almost everything is susceptible to local weed. Horses are extremely susceptible to local weed. That's where the name came from. Because local means crazy, right? And what they found was the Spanish conquistadors, when they were here in the West, and their horses, they found out that when their horses ate these plants, they started acting crazy. And horses really do. I've seen some horses have been poisoned on local weed, and they are crazy. So it's a very appropriate name for it. And so local weeds they generally are in the Astragalus and Oxytropis genera, and they are the ones that contain the toxin swainsinine. So there's thousands of different Astragalus plants in the world, but only the ones that contain swainsinine are considered local weeds. A lot of the Astragalus plants that you see out in the mountains are more of like a vetch, is what we call them, and they're not a problem. There are some that contain nitrotoxins that are also problematic. You know, I feel sorry for ranchers that have to graze in the Intermountain West because it's one problem after another.
I was just gonna say that. Plants, predators.
Yeah. Well, and you get some of these plants that kind of knock them down a little bit and just makes them super susceptible to a predator. But thanks for your hard work. So this just kind of shows the distribution of some of the more problematic local weeds species that are here in the Intermountain West. And because of the range that they cover, and it affects everything. So it affects the growth and development of an animal, you know, an adult animal. It kind of causes a wasting syndrome in them. You know, almost any animal you see, a cow, a horse, a sheep that's been poisoned on local weed, they're going to kind of go through this wasting syndrome. So this takes time. It's a chronic poisoning. It takes 3 to 4 weeks before you really start to see signs. So it causes the wasting syndrome. It affects their behavior, as I mentioned with horses. With horses, it affects their ability to their proprioceptive ability. So they don't recognize where their legs are. And horses are kind of skittish to start with. And so when they don't know where their legs are, it kind of freaks them out, which makes it really a not safe animal to ride. It affects reproductive function of the animals in both females and males. So it affects ovulation, it affects sperm production, and so it affects pretty much everything. Because what it does is it affects the protein glycosylation, which is involved in hormones. It's involved in a lot of other processes, and then it also kind of starts to back up the cells. And so it affects everything after time. So how do we prevent local weed losses? Good question. As I mentioned, it's a chronic poisoning. So, you know, we talked about yew and death camas. That's a very acute poisoning that happens overnight. Veratrum is a very short period. Whereas local weed is more chronic. It takes weeks. It takes 3 to 4 weeks before they really become poisoned to a severe amount. So if they eat it for 1 to 2 weeks, they might start to become affected a little bit, but if you take them off of it, it's at a point that they'll recover and they'll be okay. But it's once they start to get these the lesions become in the CNS, then that's when you start to get these more permanent lesions, or as I mentioned, the reproductive effects. It usually takes a few weeks for that to kick in. So obviously you're going to want to try and avoid local weed during pregnancy. You're going to want to avoid it with the rams for at least 90 days before breeding season, because you want normal sperm production before they're put with the ewes. But one of the things we've found that works actually really well is an intermittent grazing. So if you can try and have an area that's a clean pasture, so once you see that started to eat it for a week or so, then you move them into that clean pasture, that, move them to an area where it's not quite so dense of patches. And then so their amount they eat goes down. But as I mentioned, once it gets to these neurological issues, it's kind of a permanent thing, and there's not a lot you can do. And then it becomes kind of a decision, right? This might be your favorite horse, and maybe she'll be able to recover enough to be able to use her for breeding, but you probably don't want to put your 8-year-old granddaughter on that horse, because those neurological issues are not going to resolve. Okay, lupin. So lupin is an interesting one. It causes a big problem in cattle, causes a crooked calf birth defect in the cattle, and this is maybe what it's more commonly known for today, but it will poison sheep. And with sheep, it'll poison the adults. And this usually happens when the lupin is in the pod stage. Those pods are extremely high in the toxins, and the sheep will go in and kind of selectively graze those lupin seeds. And there's been some incidences where we've had pretty large losses of sheep due to lupin. And again, it's kind of the same thing. You're getting into that period. So lupin's a legume, so it has that long taproot. And so when the grasses start to dry out and go away, the lupin is still green, has that it's high protein content plant. Those seed pods have a lot of nutrients in them, but they also can have some toxins. So that's the other point, is not all lupins are the same. Not all lupins have the toxins in them. So if you are in somewhere where you're concerned about lupin, contact us. Sometimes we can tell by the species and the location. Other times we'll have you send us a plant sample, and we'll actually analyze it to see what the toxin concentration is, because not all lupins are toxic. The other point about poisonous plants is sometimes the toxin is very labile. So once it's been dried or the plant's been ground up, or put in hay, it'll kind of dissipate. Other plant toxins are extremely stable, and so the hay is just as toxic as the green plant. And siling is always a great question. We get that question a lot, and we keep trying to develop these little small scale ensiling, like buckets to test this, and it's really hard to do on the small scale. And and we can't do it on the large scale, just for obvious reasons. So some plant toxins we know degrade during the ensiling process. Others we don't know, and maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. If anyone has a really good idea of how to do like a 5-gallon bucket size ensiling, please let me know. And as I mentioned, this is in today's scenario, this is more of a problem for cattle than sheep. Again, how to reduce losses, keep hungry animals away from dense patches, especially in the summer when it's in the pod stage. Supplemental feeding, can help with the hunger, right? But then that's an added cost, and so it's hard to do. It does cause a neuromuscular poisoning, so the worst thing you can do is find an animal that's been poisoned on lupin and try and move it, because it just exacerbates the muscle weakness. So the best thing to do is just leave them alone and let them recover. And again, lupins it's a broadleaf plant, so there's a lot of broadleaf herbicides that do a really good job in controlling it. Okay, halogeton is probably here in northern Utah, Chad, probably one of the biggest problems for sheep. It's a very invasive plant that's kind of spreading anywhere on roadsides and disturbed areas. It just just really takes over. And so, as I mentioned, one of the common areas that you see it here in areas like this is those watering sites, or the big bedding areas where the sheep get trucked in, offloaded, and they're hungry, so they're eating everything they can find. And so then next year, the only thing left is halogeton. So halogeton can be pretty toxic, but the interesting thing about halogeton is that animals can actually acclimate to it. So ruminant animals, the rumen microbes can actually learn to metabolize the oxalate. So oxalate gets metabolized into a kidney toxin, but if the animals metabolize it, then there's not a problem. So if they're slowly exposed to halogeton or greasewood or lamb's quarter, some of these other plants that contain oxalates, they'll actually develop a resistance. And we've actually shown that in experimental studies where we can kind of increase the dose and then they become pretty resistant. So again, the worst scenario is to drop them off in a dense patch, and when they're hungry and they'll eat a whole bunch of it, they die. But if you dump them off somewhere else and they kind of fill up a little bit, and then they start to trail through and they eat just a little bit as they go, then they're going to develop a resistance and they'll be okay. There are it also binds calcium and causes some issues that way. So some people try and give them like a calcium supplement, but I think the best thing to do is just allow them to, if you can, is to try and slowly start to graze it, or just keep them away. That's always the best. I think we've kind of gone through most of this. You can control it with herbicides, but it's growing in these disturbed sites, and once you spray it, what's going to come back? And it's a prolific seed producer, so you can spray it 1 year and the next year it's just going to be back. So once it's there, it's kind of hard to get rid of. We actually have a garden at our lab. We call it our poisonous plant garden, and we put halogeton in it, and every fall my boss would make us take it out before it went to seed because he didn't want it just to overtake our garden. Okay, it's just real quick to end up. As I mentioned, chokecherry and serviceberry both contain cyanide. Ruminants are more susceptible to the cyanogenic glycosides because they'll cleave that glycoside from the cyanide. And then anything that affects the plant, so drought, frost, all those kind of things that disrupt the cell will exacerbate cyanide poisoning. Young growth, as I mentioned, is extremely toxic, and also the flowers and seeds. The berries are not. You hear people always talk about having chokecherry pie or whatever. The berries are fine. The fruit doesn't contain any of the toxin. So this is one that does grow in a lot of the areas here in the West, but people also use this as an ornamental. So we just recommend that if you are going to use it as an ornamental, make sure it's not anywhere where the livestock can have access to it.
It is wild cherry tree fall into that same?
So anything that's in the cherry and actually in the rose family will have cyanide. So apple seeds have cyanide, cherry, peach, apricot, all those pits. The leaves have it, but us as we don't get poisoned because we're eating the fruit.
Right.
Plus, like how many peach pits are we going to eat? It takes a lot of apple seeds to get enough. And plus, because we're not ruminants, we don't do a very good job of cleaving that sugar from the cyanide. So we're more protected. Johnson grass, Sudan grass, those again, those are ones that become a bigger problem when there's a frost or a drought that have affected that. So the cyanide is the cyanogenic glycoside is kind of sequestered in special vacuoles in the cell. And so when the cell gets disrupted through frost or whatever, then it meets up with the enzymes and can liberate that.
So it appears also during droughts. I knew that it was after frost.
Yeah.
Was concerned.
Yeah, a lot of these droughts can also affect it. It's.
Is it toxic? I hear it is.
I don't know. I can look into it.
I got some.
You got something, you can have us look at it.
Which way is it close?
Yeah.
You have the dog bank hemp on the list.
Yeah. So we're actually gonna, again, we just collected some this summer and we're gonna try and do some more experiments because it's one of those kind of like that there's reports that it's really toxic or kind of toxic and we don't know where. And it actually, one of the things that with hemp dogbane that also tends to be a problem is it kind of grows on the periphery of alfalfa fields and grass hay fields, and then it gets built up in the hay.
Because it's a hard one to kill.
Yeah.
I've spent
It's
hundreds of dollars of chemicals trying to spray it.
yeah.
It'll brown out and it'll be right back
Yeah.
next year. But what I've understood is if they have other forage, like it's in my pasture,
Mhm.
but the grass is nice and lush, but as soon as they go in, they'll pluck off
Right.
the tender leaves.
Yeah.
They're not eating the whole stalk.
Right. And so we're probably in the next month or two, we're going to do an experiment on that to see actually how much it takes. So the hemp dogbane has the cardiac glycosides. So it's like the milkweed and the oleander and foxglove, all those plants have these. And so it's a very potent toxin, but we don't know how toxic it is to ruminants.
That lamb's quarter, or she actively seek that out.
Do they like it?
in the summer.
Yeah. So I don't think it has the high concentration of oxalates like halogeton does. And so, if they're eating it more slowly, then they're going to develop that resistance to it. So yeah, if it's not causing a problem, then it's probably because they're acclimated to it.
Well, so just to point out, Kevin, and maybe you need to repeat this online, this group are all St. Croix producers for the most part. And so we had talked outside just briefly of what breeding differences.
Right, yeah.
Like immune function, stuff like that. And Kevin had talked about, well, there are definite differences with cattle.
Yeah.
Some former research of sheep.
Yep. Yeah, so for those online, Chad just brought up the point that he and I have been talking previously about how there's breed differences for a lot of poisonous plants. And we've shown this in cattle that, for example, with larkspur, we've shown that there's huge differences in the susceptibility of different breeds of cattle to larkspur. And so that could, for some of these plants with sheep, I'm sure they're, a Western whiteface suffix or whatever is going to probably have quite a different response than a hair sheep, the St. Croix or whatever.
What sort of problems, you said oxalates are in the lamb's quarter, what problems would we see if there was any kind of toxicity?
So it would be just like let me go back to the halogeton. Where did I put sometimes I don't do a very good job putting the exact same information of every plant on every slide. I'm trying to remember what the initial clinical signs.
Halogeton happens pretty fast.
Yeah.
So
I'd have to. So if I could to put
You have to be watching
yeah,
that exact time, when you're either alive or you're dead, if it's just that short.
kind of like that.
So your symptoms would be death.
That's it though, I mean.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
yes,
and
yes.
or at least, if you checked them in the morning and they'd had a sublethal dose, they might still be just, very lethargic and not, it does affect the kidneys. So, but you're not going to be waiting around watching to see if they're urinating and, things like that. But I'd have to look up the specific clinical signs, but
It says depression, weakness, reluctance to move, rapid or shallow respiration, drooling, recumbency, comatose, death.
so and you could put that up for almost any
Yeah.
poisoned animal. So just, you know, if they're not doing, as long as they're doing well, you know, they're okay. If they're not doing well and there was a big patch of lamb's quarter or halogeton, then you might start to, but you know, it's also, as I mentioned, did you just drop them off? Or have they been grazing there for?
They won't eat it while it's green and growing in the spring, so by the end of the summer, there are patches of it, and it started to turn brown.
Yeah.
That's when they said they actively
Yeah.
go to find it.
And as I mentioned, some plants, the toxicity actually changes as the growing season goes. So some plants actively produce the toxin all year long. And other times they kind of, it's almost like when they come out of the ground, that's how much they have. So as the plant grows, it kind of dilutes over the, you know, and then other plants, when the plant starts to senesce, then it kind of puts some of those things back down on the roots to save them for next year. And so then the plant becomes less toxic.
We have a question from the.
Yeah.
Can the oxalate consumption, such as from lamb's quarter, contribute to urinary calculi?
It can. So what it's doing is the oxalate binds with calcium and forms these insoluble calcium oxalates that go into the kidney and then plug up the kidney, and then you get those. So it's the exact same chemistry as if a dog drinks ethylene glycol in you know, in your antifreeze. It's the same thing that happens in there.
So if you give them alcohol, if you give your sheep alcohol, they might recover?
In theory, if you prevent that metabolism, yeah, that is actually a treatment for human poisoning of ethylene glycol, is to compete with the metabolism. Yep, we've actually dosed some animals with toxins that we extracted in ethanol, and it actually caused almost like a drunk animal.
Wait, I've had an increase in nightshade type plants in my area.
Yep.
I mean, I found one variety last year, and now I've got a second variety.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about nightshades here. It's not one that we've been informed is a big issue for sheep, so I didn't bring that up. It is a problem for cattle. And nightshades do have a lot of toxins and different classes of toxins, and some of them are very potent toxins. So it kind of depends on the specific nightshade and what it has. So
I identified one as cutleaf nightshade.
So I think it's on the list for poisonous, but it's probably one that you don't want to promote them to graze it. But if you haven't had, you know,
I've seen, I mean, I don't know if it's an oxalate. I've seen them perhaps eat some, but no problems.
Yeah.
And maybe they've learned to metabolize it. There's always other food sources.
yeah, so it's just probably a dose issue. Most of the toxins in nightshade are similar to like atropine, and so will cause the same thing. Yeah, and things like that. And but then there's also some neuromuscular toxins, and those are the ones that are that can be problematic. But it just depends on the specific species.
Thank you.
I know we're out of time, but we do have an app for your phone. It's just, if you just go into the App Store, you can try and screenshot this and it worked. Okay. So it works for both Apple and Android, and it just has a list. I don't know, some of you might have seen, we have a little booklet that we call, it's a bulletin on poisonous plants. What we did was we put that booklet into an app. So it has all the information in here, and it works offline. So if you're up in the mountains or, you know, somewhere where you don't have cell service, you can pull it up, and it just has kind of the basic information of where the plant grows, what it does, and then how you can manage animals, and then how you can, you know, if herbicides are a possibility, what herbicides might be a good treatment option. Okay. All right, thank you.
Real quick before you sit down, a pair of wool socks from the Utah wool growers, and appreciation from the St. Croix Association that came. So, okay, well, I really appreciate that. I mean, as an animal scientist, there are only so many species of livestock and breeds of sheep, and I only really get to know a couple really well. And we often ask our plant scientists to know every single species of plant, and that could be overwhelming. And so they do. Kevin and the team he works with are incredible. Reach out to them, use their resources. They're great.